So the migrations project has been a really significant undertaking for me and very challenging in a lot of ways, not least just practically finding the time and the resources to spend a year working on something major like this. It was challenging personally because of the places that I was going to and the stories that I encountered and meeting people in real distress. It was upsetting at times, and it was, as I say, hugely challenging. But also because I knew that the paintings I was producing needed to be very different from what I'd produced before in order to engage properly with this different subject matter, the different topics and the different work. But overall, it was incredibly inspiring for many reasons, but artistically hugely satisfying to create work that was new to me and that opened up this huge area of discovery creatively for me. So I've always been fascinated by behaviour, wildlife behaviour, particularly birds, and particularly fascinated by migration. And in the course of sketching and painting, I've joined in with scientific research projects and followed our migrating birds right up into the Arctic, through the Mediterranean and down into Africa. And about 4 years ago, when it was the summer of boats and people were arriving on islands in the Mediterranean in obvious distress, I was watching news broadcasts from these transit points and was struck and hugely compelled by the imagery of people living in the same day-to-day survival mode as wild creatures and travelling exactly the same lines of flight as migratory birds. I reflected a lot upon the fact that at this time people were being referred to by commentators and politicians in bestial terms. They're being talked about as swarms, as plagues, as cockroaches, as rats. And as a wildlife artist, I'm compelled by imagery of wild creatures. But I knew there would be something quite reflective about taking my practice and painting people using the same processes of research and representation as I use for drawing animals and reflecting back on that. And somehow I wanted to connect with this imagery that I'd seen on television and experience what was going on in these places, even if it was only fleetingly. So I got some feel of the texture, the landscape, the atmosphere of what it was like to be there, and try and conjure that up in the paintings that I was producing. And through this process, and through the researches that I did, I struck upon some studies that have been done, particularly in the States, that tie together climate change and the effect that that has on conflict and increasing refugee crises, which in turn put pressure on the environments of the places that people flee to and the places that people leave behind where the agriculture and the irrigation breaks down. And this imagery of people arriving on our shores, telling us about what is going on, what is going wrong in areas far away from where we live, resonated really strongly with the idea of birds as environmental indicators. So ecologists look to the birds to see that changes in their populations and their migrations point towards problems in the larger environment. And there's a real parallel between what we're seeing with people and what we're seeing with what the birds are doing. These changes in behaviour, the changes in what's going on, point towards things that are wrong in our environment. The first trip I went on was to Cali, jungle camp in Cali, and I joined up with a couple of charities that were working there. And I went and I watched and I began to sketch what I was seeing there. And in speaking to people, refugees and charity workers, the stories I was hearing were heartbreaking. And I found it very difficult to try and portray what was happening to these people. I'd hear someone's story and it occurred to me, how can I tell that story in a way that is any better or more meaningful than them telling it? And I found that what I was trying to do was use imagery from around the camps, the incidental things that I was seeing, the fences, the shacks, the tents, the ephemera of the camp, and the ephemera of the lives that these people were leading, to use that to suggest part of the story that I was investigating and trying to retell. As I went to different camps and transit points, I did some volunteer work in partnership with some of the charities that I was speaking to. And in Cali, I did some art engagement work with some of the unaccompanied children. And this was an opportunity just to get these kids involved and try and break down some barriers so that the charity workers who were with me could then engage and have a proper conversation with these kids and try and find out if they needed more warm clothes or shoes or medical aid or some help with registering at the camps where they were being decanted to by the French authorities. In the UK, I helped organise some activities with local mosques and welcoming organisations and local charities, particularly just setting up kind of arts and crafts tables, which was an excuse to keep the kids busy whilst the adults could talk and get information and help with resources that they needed. But also I would help create work that could then be put on the walls with the child's name, so that they immediately had a connection with the place where they had now settled. So they had a community centre or a school or a town hall where they had a presence and a place where they would be going back to, where their name and their creative work was on the wall. In Jordan, I was staying with a Syrian family, and then I volunteered to teach art classes in one of the refugee schools out in the desert. And these were kids aged from sort of 5 to 14. I did a range of different art classes with them. Some of it was just mixing colours, some of it was big landscape mural work, all kinds of things. And the direction that I had from the schools was to try and engage with these kids' creative opportunities. And what I found was these children their lives had been entirely disrupted by war and by their forced emigration, and they had no opportunity to explore their creative selves, and this was a chance for them to do that. In Cali, it was extraordinary speaking to these youngsters who had been travelling for perhaps 4 months, 6 months, travelling by themselves through war zones, living rough, nowhere safe to sleep, no idea where they were going to be passed on to next, no idea where they would find food. These kids had sorted themselves into little groups of 4 or 5 youngsters, all who could speak the same language, and this was their support network, the people who they could rely on. And consequently, they were very closed groups. They would not engage with anyone who was an authority figure, and that included the charity workers. So the art activities that I did allowed some of those barriers to break down. And through one morning in particular, where I was handing out pens and getting these kids to draw and paint, I hand some material over to a youngster. I'd look at him and think, this guy is 17, going on 18. And a minute later, I would turn around and see him crouched down on the ground, colouring in and drawing and writing his name. And I'd look again and think, no, he's 14. That protective shell, that hardness that they put up as a defence that made them seem so prematurely aged had kind of fallen away. I found when I was out at transit points and camps and travelling, I would just employ the same methods that I used for sketching wildlife, but without telescope or binoculars. I would just sit down on the edges of things, sketch and draw. And there was something about that. I never took a camera with me. That would have changed the entire dynamics of what I was doing and been really intrusive. But simply sitting down somewhere near the edge of the camp and just sketching and drawing the things that I was seeing around me, I would become a point of interest and yet unobtrusive. So people would come up to me, and because I was sitting on the ground, I wasn't a threat. I was not approaching people, and they felt comfortable in coming up to me and seeing what I was doing and asking, it just seemed so strange. What was I doing there? And I managed to establish some really good conversations with people, and it just seemed to come naturally. And particularly when we perhaps didn't have a common language, we could, I could show them what I was doing, and we could communicate by pointing at things in the pictures and pointing at things in the landscape. I live a really privileged, comfortable life. I spend my time out in beautiful places, drawing and sketching, doing the things that I really love. And then I'll come back to my studio and spend just reflective time on my own with music in the background, painting and recreating these wonderful experiences that I've had. And this project took me right outside my comfort zone. I was in places which were deeply depressing, people who were living really restricted lives, hearing stories about their experiences which were very upsetting. And these were often quite edgy places, particularly in places like Sicily, where I was in very unofficial camps that, it was just guys living rough in the middle of nowhere. And I was very aware that I was intruding on what was real suffering. And I was there observing and sketching, and there's a certain voyeuristic part of that where it feels very exploitative, and it felt natural to be drawing and recording and to try and tell some of that story. But I was aware all the way through this process of how awkward all of this could feel. And also sometimes how unsafe sometimes it was in some of these places. I was saying earlier that art's deeply selfish. You want to do something, and you, as a person, as an artist, you just move your entire life around so that you can do what you want to do. But there's another part of it where you're trying to express and reach out with it. And, that I felt really compelled by what was going on, and I wanted to connect with it. It's very difficult to verbalise, but I wanted to sort of process and tell this set of interconnected stories that I feel compelled by, and I hope will kind of engender a sense of shared humanity in the people that see the work. But to do that credibly, for this work to have some integrity, it also means having some direct connection with what's really going on the ground. And I know that that's going to be superficial. It just will be. But it is an opportunity, or has been an opportunity, for me to feel some small part of what is going on in these places, and to connect directly with these people who have suffered so much. And I feel that lends some reality to what I'm trying to process and represent.